So Meghan Markle's jam isn't the only thing that isn't moving the way everyone expected, because over in the UK, William just physically stopped his father from handing over one of the monarchy's most symbolically important homes to Camilla. And the way he did it was so direct and so loaded with constitutional implications that the family is still trying to figure out what the fallout actually means. The document was already on the table. King Charles had chosen the residence, approved the transfer, and was basically ready to put pen to paper to give Camilla permanent control. But before that signature could happen, William walked into the room and stopped the decision cold. Not with a whispered suggestion, not with a delayed memo, not with a soft request to reconsider. The future king declared that no residence belonging to the crown would be handed over without a formal vote, and honestly, the fact that he had to say that out loud tells you everything about how far along this plan already was. Before we unpack the whole mess, if you're into royal deep dives where we actually look at the documents and the timelines instead of just the headlines, hit subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what comes next. Okay, so Charles had expected questions. He probably expected pushback, but he did not expect his son to walk in and physically place his hand over the unsigned authorization. The gesture was calm, which somehow makes it more brutal. William wasn't asking his father to reconsider, he was stopping him. Charles looked down at his son's hand on the document, then raised his eyes and said nothing. He had genuinely believed his authority as king would settle the matter. Instead, the prince had drawn a line across it. Camilla knew nothing until an aide found her in the corridor. She had already discussed staffing, renovations, how the household would operate. In her mind, this was happening. Then the message came that William had blocked the transfer. The queen consort stopped walking, dismissed the aide, entered a room, and closed the door without a word. Humiliation arrived before anger did. And that's a detail that matters because it explains everything about how she reacted later. William carried more than just an objection into that room. He produced a constitutional briefing, a formal document explaining the legal and financial limits surrounding royal decisions. The briefing showed that permanent control couldn't be granted privately, while security, maintenance, and ceremonial costs remained tied to crown funding. The transfer would affect future reigns and the next sovereign's authority. It wasn't just about who got to live where. It was about who would be forced to pay for that decision decades from now. Silence was impossible after that. Anne hadn't been informed. Several family members whose approval Charles would eventually need had been kept completely in the dark. Only a narrow circle had seen the authorization. And William feared that secrecy had been essential to the plan, which is such an interesting word choice because it suggests the decision hadn't just been rushed, it had been protected from challenge. Like if the transfer was straightforward and obviously appropriate, why was it being handled so quietly? That's where it gets weird. Procedure was only the surface. William believed the late queen had left a specific promise concerning the residence, and he intended to confront Charles with her exact words. But before he could reveal what the monarch had demanded, he first had to face the painful truth about why his father wanted to give Camilla the residence so badly. Behind the argument over walls, keys, and signatures were three people fighting for three entirely different futures. Charles saw the residence as the final proof that his wife had been accepted. Not tolerated, not accommodated, but genuinely accepted. Camilla saw it as protection against the day her husband could no longer defend her. William saw the same building as something inherited in trust, not a private gift, but a symbol that belonged to the crown beyond any marriage, grievance, or personal promise. Those are three completely different understandings of what the same building represents, and none of them are entirely wrong, which is what makes this so complicated. Charles carried the deepest personal wound. For years he had watched Camilla perform royal duties while still sensing resistance around her. Crowds applauded, officials bowed. Yet acceptance often seemed conditional, as though one change in power could leave her exposed again. Giving her the residence would be more than an act of generosity. It would be his strongest declaration that she was not a temporary figure beside the sovereign, but a permanent part of the monarchy he had built around her. And if you understand that emotional context, his actions make perfect sense. William understood the emotion too. He wasn't blind to it, but he feared the precedent. The prince knew that every private arrangement made now could become a burden during his own reign. A royal asset wasn't simply a valuable property. It was a home held by the crown for official use. Across generations, once personal promises began reshaping those boundaries, the future king believed every limit would become easier to break. Charles saw that resistance as a rejection of his marriage. William saw the transfer as proof that affection had begun to overpower judgment. Neither man believed he was betraying the other. Yet betrayal was exactly what both felt. The king believed his son had chosen procedure over family. The heir believed his father had chosen one private vow over the institution they were both sworn to protect. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a fundamental collision of values. Camilla sat alone with a preliminary floor plan opened before her. She studied the marked rooms, then folded the document and returned it to its folder. Her anger was real, but fear ran beneath it. William's intervention had exposed the truth she had tried not to face. Her security might last only as long as Charles remained strong enough to guarantee it. That's a terrifying position to be in, and it explains why the residence mattered so much to her, beyond just status or comfort. Catherine had understood that danger before the confrontation began. During a private conversation, William admitted that challenging his father could cause lasting damage. She didn't tell him what to do. Instead, the princess warned that silence would become consent once the transfer was signed. Her words stayed with him when he entered the office. That's such a precise piece of advice because it reframes the entire situation. It wasn't about whether William wanted a conflict, it was about whether inaction would make him complicit in something he believed was wrong. Months earlier, Charles had made Camilla a personal promise after she confessed her fear of being left without a secure royal home. He assured her that she would always have won. The transfer was his attempt to keep that intimate vow, but Anne recognized William's demand for a vote. She had heard the same warning during a recorded private conversation with the late Queen when Charles never knew had taken place. And when she finally opened the sealed account, the family dispute became a battle over the monarch's final boundary. The crisis hadn't begun with William's hand covering a document. It began years earlier during a private evening at Windsor when the late Queen summoned Anne after a tense family dinner. No quarters remained in the room. No announcement followed. Yet before the Princess Royal left, the monarch had made one instruction unmistakably clear. Residences attached to the sovereign's office were never to become rewards for personal loyalty, no matter who sat on the throne. The distinction mattered more than anyone at that dinner understood. Privately owned royal homes, snorts, could be inherited, gifted, or placed into family trusts. An official residence was different. It existed to support the work of the sovereign, and its costs, staff, security, and ceremonial purpose extended beyond one reign. The Queen feared that once those boundaries were weakened, personal affection could quietly become permanent institutional obligation. Anne listened without interrupting. Her mother didn't speak with bitterness, nor did she attack Camilla. Instead, the monarch asked her daughter to remember one principle. Generosity must never be confused with ownership. The Princess Royal understood that this wasn't casual advice. It was a warning meant for a future crisis, and that warning had been triggered only hours earlier. During dinner at Windsor Castle, Camilla had spoken about establishing a permanent household in the Queen's official residence. Charles answered without hesitation. When the authority became his, he said he would make certain it happened. The late monarch heard every word. She placed her glass down, looked directly at her son, and ended the conversation before anyone could soften what had just been promised. Later that night, the Queen admitted in a recorded private conversation with Anne that her concern wasn't personal hostility toward Camilla, her fear was much larger. If royal property became compensation for emotional wounds, then every private reassurance could eventually demand public funding, permanent staffing, and protection from future sovereigns. The monarch acted immediately. She dictated a short memorandum of formal written instruction preserved for official reference, and then added one handwritten sentence of her own. No permanent reassignment of the residence, she wrote, should occur without collective consultation and recorded approval. That sentence is everything. It didn't say the transfer couldn't happen. It said it couldn't happen quietly, privately, without anyone checking whether it made sense. Anne kept a certified copy. She never used it while her mother lived because no transfer had yet been attempted. Charles received only a general warning that the property must remain available for official duties. He was never told that the Queen had specifically rejected granting it permanently to any consort without a vote. Now the hidden record had become impossible to ignore. Anne placed the document before William and explained its origin through her documented account of that Windsor conversation. He read the handwritten line twice, closed the folder, and refused to let palace officials carry the confrontation for him. With the late Queen's words in his possession, William walked toward his father's private office, knowing that one sentence could stop the transfer and fracture the family. There were no advisors between them. When William returned to the king's office, Charles stood beside the desk with the authorization still unsigned. His son entered carrying the late Queen's memorandum, closed the door, and placed the page beside the transfer order. What followed wasn't a constitutional lecture. It was a confrontation between a father determined to protect his wife and an heir refusing to inherit the consequences of that protection. William spoke first. He told Charles that the residence belonged to the crown, not to any one marriage or reign. It was supported through official structures, which meant its staff, security, upkeep, and ceremonial role were tied to the monarchy itself. That made the transfer more than a private act. It would bind those who came after them. Charles didn't retreat. The king argued that sovereigns had always held authority over royal households. He insisted that Camilla's permanent use of the property would not remove it from the crown. In his mind, the arrangement would protect both the residents and his wife. He saw stability. William saw a precedent that couldn't easily be reversed. The prince pushed the unsigned order back across the desk. You cannot give away what you hold in trust. Charles's expression changed at once. He accused his son of confusing guardianship with disobedience. William answered that loyalty didn't mean silence. The future king refused to inherit a decision made from emotion and then defended as tradition. Camilla entered before either man could continue. She had learned that her future was being decided behind a closed door and she would not remain outside it. The queen consort looked directly at William and asked whether he believed she'd earned nothing after years of service. William chose his words carefully. He said, "Service could earn respect, protection, and dignity, but it couldn't create personal ownership over an official residence." Camilla heard the distinction, yet it struck her as rejection. To her, he wasn't defending a rule. He was reminding her that acceptance still had limits. Then William turned the memorandum toward Charles. The king recognized his mother's handwriting before reaching a final sentence. He sat down slowly, visibly shaken by the knowledge that she had anticipated this exact conflict. The document required consultation before any permanent reassignment. Charles immediately understood who had kept it. Anne had preserved the record and said nothing while his plans advanced. His anger shifted toward his sister. He called her silence a betrayal. Still, the king refused to surrender. He left the transfer unsigned, but ordered the proposal placed before the Royal Estates Council, the body responsible for major decisions involving official royal property. The signature had been stopped, but the battle was no longer private. And the coming vote would reveal who served the king, who served the crown, and who believed the two were no longer the same. Once the proposal entered the council chamber, a motion had to disguise itself as procedure. Every chair was occupied. Every document had been numbered. Yet beneath the formal language sat the same dangerous question. Could the king use institutional power to satisfy a personal promise? Charles believed the room would defer to him. William believed the late queen's instruction would prevail. Camilla knew the result would define more than where she lived. Charles opened the discussion with controlled confidence. The Royal Estates Council couldn't be ignored. Now the king still had the right to propose the arrangement, but permanent exclusive control required approval because the costs and consequences would continue beyond his reign. The positions formed quickly. Several senior officials supported a renewable agreement, allowing Camilla to occupy the residence while Charles remained sovereign. William and Anne rejected any wording that suggested permanent personal possession. Edward searched for a middle path, one that would protect the queen consort's dignity without weakening the boundary around crown property. Charles listened as loyalty began to separate from obedience. Each speaker addressed him respectfully, but respected didn't become support. The king tapped one finger against the table as another objection was raised. Then he noticed William watching the gesture and his hand became still. The future king said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence carried the pressure of everything that had already passed between them. Anne opened the late queen's memorandum and began reading. The Princess Royal kept her voice firm through the formal wording. Then she reached the handwritten final line. She paused, swallowed, and continued. Her documented reading confirmed that no permanent reassignment should happen without consultation and recorded approval. Honoring her mother's instruction meant causing pain to her brother, and she felt every word of it. The chamber tightened further when a financial clause was uncovered. The original transfer would have placed long-term renovation, staffing, and security costs under crown funding, even if Camilla later stopped carrying out official duties. What had been presented as a housing arrangement now looked like a permanent obligation imposed on future reigns. That's the detail that changes everything. It wasn't just about who got the keys. It was about who got the bill potentially forever. William finally offered a compromise. He supported Camilla's full use of the residence during Charles's reign with complete dignity, protection, and household support. But once that reign ended, the property would return automatically to unrestricted crown use. His proposal proved that he wasn't trying to drive her out. He was trying to stop a temporary promise from becoming permanent law. The council remained divided. Charles couldn't simply impose the transfer, but he could withdraw it, amend it, or defend it until the final vote. Every voice fell silent as the king reached for the original document. Charles had entered the chamber, determined to fulfill his promise. But the clause hidden inside that promise now forced him to choose between protecting Camilla and protecting the authority he would leave to William. The decision reached Camilla before the official statement was prepared. She would be permitted to use the residence as queen while Charles remained sovereign, but it wouldn't become her permanent royal property. No future entitlement would be guaranteed. No personal transfer would survive the reign. The distinction looked technical on paper. Yet when she heard it spoken aloud, Camilla understood the emotional verdict immediately. She could inhabit the queen's residence, but she could never possess it. Charles had withdrawn the original proposal and accepted William's revised arrangement. The queen consort would receive full protection, staffing, and use of the property during the reign, but ownership and future control would remain with the crown. What had once been presented as a permanent promise had been reduced to temporary permission, and that difference cut deeper than any public statement could admit. The consequences began at once. Officials froze renovation plans involving lasting structural changes. Staffing appointments were reviewed. Documents describing the residence as Camilla's future private home were recalled and rewritten. Every alteration made the decision feel more final because each correction removed another trace of the certainty Charles had given her. Camilla sat alone with the unused keys on the table. She didn't throw them aside. She didn't summon an aide. When the king entered, she looked at him and asked only, "Did you ever have the power to promise it?" Charles couldn't answer immediately. The silence exposed everything. He finally admitted that he had promised certainty because he wanted to erase years of rejection and insecurity. The monarch had believed that giving her a permanent royal home would prove that no one could push her aside again. Camilla listened, then told him that a promise made without the power to keep it had offered comfort at first and humiliation in the end. William soon learned how she had interpreted the result. The prince was told through a private palace briefing that Camilla believed he had used procedure to define her publicly as temporary. That accusation unsettled him. He had protected the institution, but he now understood that victory on paper could still leave a wound powerful enough to poison the family. Catherine responded before the damage hardened. In a private written message, the princess explained that the vote had never been intended to remove Camilla from royal life. She acknowledged the cruelty of belonging to a system where every home title and privilege could become a reminder that acceptance had legal limits. Camilla read the message twice but sent no reply. Instead, she requested a private meeting with William. No Charles, no advisors, no prepared statements. The council had settled the property question, but behind a closed door, William and Camilla were about to decide whether the family could survive the meaning each had attached to it. William expected anger when he entered the private drawing room. Instead, he found Camilla standing beside a cold fireplace with no aids, folders, or prepared arguments between them. She didn't ask him to reverse the vote. She asked whether he had ever intended to let her feel secure within the monarchy. His answer would determine whether the dispute ended as a constitutional correction or hardened into a personal rupture that neither Charles nor the crown could repair. Camilla made one condition before they began. Nothing said in that room would be carried through secretaries, legal advisors, or palace statements. William agreed. For the first time since the crisis began, they would speak without institutional language, protecting them from the truth. William explained that his resistance had never been about removing her dignity. Once a sovereign used crown property to settle a private obligation, he said the next monarch inherited more than the expense. He inherited the president. The future king would be expected to defend a promise he had never made, funded through an institution that was never meant to serve one marriage forever. Camilla listened, then revealed the fear she had hidden from everyone except Charles. His declining energy and William's growing authority had made the future feel uncertain. The queen consort didn't know where she would belong when the reign ended, or whether her security would depend on the goodwill of people who had never fully accepted her. The residents had represented protection from that possibility. William didn't dismiss the fear. The prince admitted that he had often treated her role as a political reality rather than a human one. He had focused on rules, consequences, and inheritance, while ignoring what it meant to live beside a crown that could offer status one day and uncertainty the next. He couldn't give her ownership of an official residence, but he accepted that her future shouldn't depend on affection or shifting family loyalties. Then he offered another path. William would support a privately funded lifetime residence for Camilla, secured through personal royal resources rather than crown property. It would protect her independence without binding future sovereigns or removing an official home from institutional use. Camilla finally admitted the truth. She had never needed that particular building as much as she needed proof that she wouldn't be cast aside. Once that fear was answered directly, she agreed to endorse the council's decision through a recorded palace statement. Her acceptance ended the excuse for further conflict. William returned to Charles carrying a solution, not a victory. When he delivered Camilla's answer, the king finally understood that the obstacle had never been his son's cruelty, but the danger hidden inside his own desperate promise. By morning, the private dispute had escaped the palace. Broadcasters interrupted their schedules. Newspaper editors replaced planned covers. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, divided between those who believed William had humiliated the queen and those who saw his intervention as the first proof that the future king would place constitutional restraint above family pressure. One unsigned document had become a national test of what the monarchy owned, what it merely managed, and whom it ultimately served. Palace officials moved quickly. Their formal statement confirmed that Camilla would retain full use of the residence while Charles remained sovereign, but the property itself would stay permanently attached to the crown. The wording stressed continuity, accountability, and unanimous acceptance of the revised arrangement. Yet the explanation did little to calm the debate. It merely gave both sides new language for the same emotional battle. Commentators split almost immediately. Some described William as an heir who had publicly challenged a reigning monarch. Others argued that the prince had acted responsibly by protecting the institution he would one day inherit. One side saw disobedience. The other saw preparation. Between those two judgments stood a family already bruised by what the public was only beginning to understand. Charles unfolded the morning newspaper at breakfast and found the headline waiting for him. William blocks royal home deal. The king folded the page inward before Camilla could see it, but she had already read every word. Neither spoke. His attempt to shield her came too late, just as his original promise had. William faced the noise outside the palace walls. Leaving an official engagement, the future king heard one voice praise him for protecting the crown. Another accused him of humiliating his father. He paused for only a moment, then continued without answering. Duty had given him no clean victory, only a decision that different people would interpret through their own loyalties. The strongest public moment unfolded beside the Victoria Memorial, where a broadcaster explained that private royal property could be inherited, while an official residence remained tied to the sovereign's work and future reigns. An elderly woman in the crowd held a photograph of the late queen and said she would have wanted the rules to survive the people. Her words spread faster than the palace statement. Then Camilla ended the speculation herself. In a recorded public message, the Queen Consort confirmed that she accepted the Council's decision and supported preserving the residence for future sovereigns. Her intervention stopped the dispute from becoming an open war between royal factions. Charles responded by asking both William and Camilla to join him at the next official engagement. The appearance wouldn't erase the wound, but it would reveal whether they could stand together after power, fear, and loyalty had been stripped of all disguise. The public had delivered its arguments, but the monarchy's final verdict would come not through headlines or applause. It would come in the way Charles chose to stand beside the son who stopped him. The final resolution didn't come with a dramatic resignation, an exile, or a royal punishment. It came when Charles entered the state reception with Camilla beside him and William one step behind. For a brief moment the king stopped, turned toward his son, and invited him forward. The gesture was small, but its meaning was unmistakable. William had challenged his father's decision, yet he hadn't tried to take his place. He had protected the place itself. Charles knew the settlement had changed more than one household. The Royal Estates Council recorded the residence as crown property that could be assigned for use, but never permanently transferred through an unreviewed personal promise. Any future change would require consultation and a documented vote, ensuring that one reign couldn't quietly bind the next. Camilla's future was secured through a separate lifetime housing arrangement funded by private royal resources. The Queen Consort would retain dignity, independence, and protection without placing a permanent obligation on the sovereign's official estate. The compromise gave her safety, but it also forced Charles to confront the pain behind his mistake. Charles apologized before the engagement. He told Camilla that he had confused possession with security and admitted that his desire to prove her acceptance had led him to promise something he held only temporarily. She didn't punish him with anger. Instead, she told the king that honesty had finally given her what the residents never could: certainty without illusion. William faced his father next. Charles confessed that being stopped by his own heir had felt like a public loss of authority. The prince answered that remaining silent would have created a greater loss later. The monarch didn't celebrate those words, but he accepted their truth. William then refused to claim victory. He asked that no palace statement describe the outcome as his triumph. The future king insisted that the council's vote, the late queen's written instruction, and Camilla's recorded consent had made the decision legitimate. Days later, Camilla entered the residence not as its owner, but as the queen trusted with its care. She canceled the proposed personal alterations and asked that one room honor the history of previous consorts. The verdict was final. Charles protected his wife. William protected the crown. Camilla secured her future without possessing what belonged to those who would follow. Personal devotion had been corrected before it became permanent royal law, and the monarchy emerged wounded, restrained, but still standing because one future king had the nerve to place his hand over a document and ask whether anyone had actually checked if this was allowed.